Okay, just kidding. This is what happens when you decide to try a new version of recording your videos and you don't actually know how it works. So the video cut out. It shouldn't do that anymore. I think I fixed it. But I was saying that Sheol's test only worked if you had large amounts of poison in your system. He couldn't detect small amounts. So then I was going to give you a little bit of insight as to who this guy was. So his nickname was Hard Luck Sheol. And it's because even though he was brilliant and discovered a bunch of different things, he made lots of chemical discoveries. He never actually got very much credit for it. So people who did get the credit just kind of stole his shine or stole his glory a little bit. So it kind of sucked. But this is kind of his one big thing. Everyone associates him as the guy that came up with a way to test for poison. So he still made a contribution. We're grateful. Okay, our next person is Alphonse Bertillon. That's the French way of saying it. Bertillon. Okay, so he was a French anthropologist. We've studied that. We know these are our people who look at things like skeletal remains and they can figure out gender and they can figure out ethnicity and a bunch of other things just from skeletons and bones and certain types of measurements. So this man introduced or created a system of measurement called the Bertillon system. It's also known as anthropometry, and it's used to identify individuals, but it's all based on the size of different body parts. So he might take the distance between your two eyes and he would record that, and that was a number that was specific to you. He would record the length of your ear, or how wide your mouth was, or how far away from the top of your head your jaw was. Just a series of different kinds of measurements all over your body, and we use those numbers to help us to identify an individual person. The system actually worked for a really long time. This was our go-to identification system before fingerprinting. This was fingerprinting before fingerprinting was big, if that makes sense. And it was only replaced in 1903 by a very interesting case, which we will do a study on, so I don't want to give it away, but it's called the Will West case, and it's very, very interesting. So, Alphonse Bertillon, that's his claim to fame. Okay, our next guy is Valentin Ross, who is not who this image is of. Valentin Ross was a German chemist, and in 1806, he discovered a more precise way to detect arsenic poisoning. So even smaller amounts than Sheol. Sheol needed a lot. This guy only needed a little bit. And the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is, that the test worked by looking at the cells in the stomach of the victim. So that's just kind of a cool thing. Then our next scientist is Orfilier. Orfilier was Spanish, and he is known as the father of forensic toxicology. So that is a big deal because that's a huge field within forensics now. He published the very first scientific paper or article on all the different ways that you could detect poisons. He's done some other things, but that was his main claim to fame. He's the father of toxicology. Okay, James Marsh was a Scottish English. There's a lot of debate on whether he was actually from Scotland or if he was from England, but whatever. So, Scottish or English chemist. And in 1839, he kind of became our first expert witness, if you will, on a murder trial. So, he was the first to testify in a criminal trial on all of the different methods you could use to detect arsenic in a victim's body. So he took those tests that the other two guys did and refined them even more, and then was able to use that information in an actual court of law. Hans Gross is our next scientist. Hans Gross was Austrian, and while he wasn't specifically a forensic scientist or even a criminalist, he did have a background in the judicial system. So he was a judge and a prosecutor for a really long time. But in 1893, he published the book, if you will, Criminal Investigation. And he talks about how you use a bunch of different types of science when you're doing criminal investigations. He kind of was the spearhead or the father figure, if you will, of criminal profiling. So the field of criminology got its start thanks to him. So let's go ahead and write that in, please. We're going to write in that he is the father of criminal profiling or criminology. Okay. All right, we're moving on. Okay, Karl Landsteiner is a personal favorite of mine, probably because he's kind of a blood scientist type guy, and there's a lot of biology in what he did, or, well, I almost said does, but what he did. So, Karl Landsteiner was born in Vienna, and in 1901, he discovered the ABO blood typing system. It's still the same system that we use today to figure out our blood groups or our blood types. Now, he made many other discoveries, lots of medical discoveries and other forms of scientific discoveries. He even won like a Nobel Prize for some of his work on blood grouping. So that's his big thing. That's his big contribution to the field of forensics is blood typing. Then we have Carl Osborne, who is an American scientist. And in 1910, he published the book Questioned Documents. So he's kind of like the point man or the father figure, if you will, of document analysis and things like handwriting and different types of paper and ink and that sort of thing. Okay, we're moving on to the next person. The next person is like forensic science rock star status. Okay, his name is Edmond Locard, and these dates are his birth and death dates. So birth. Oh my goodness, y'all, I can't get it together. Let's try this again. Maybe. I don't know what just happened. Oh, okay. That's not what I wanted to do, but we're gonna make it work. Okay, so here we go. No. I hope you're laughing because I sure am laughing at myself at this stage in the process. There we go. Okay. Maybe? No, still not doing it. Yeah. Okay, this is not working. Well, we're just going to keep going. So 1877 was the year he was born, and 1966 was the year he died. He originally was a French doctor, but also a criminalist, and he came up with a huge principle in crime scene investigation, one we still use today, which is called Locard's exchange principle. And it talks all about how every time you enter or exit a space or a room, or you make contact with someone or something, you leave a little bit of evidence behind from your person or your body, and you take a little bit of evidence with you from that person or the location that you were in. And we'll talk more about this later on. Another thing that he did that was really cool is he opened the very first crime lab in France, and that lab still exists and is still running to this day. Okay, we're going to move on. Hopefully, the next slide is a whole lot smoother. Walther McCrone is an American chemist, and these are, again, his birth and death dates, so 1916, or years, I should say, to 2002. And his background's a little bit interesting. So he is a chemist. That's what he went to school for. That's what his degree is in. He really was more of an analytical chemist. So it was all about data and using machinery to come up with numbers and answers given by data. But he took what is normally considered a biology piece of equipment, the microscope, and found chemical applications for it. So not only was he an analytical chemist, he was also a microscope expert. And he used those abilities to examine and give evidence against two kind of controversial pieces of history, if you will. So he has examined the Shroud of Turin and the Vinland map. And I'll tell you just a little bit about what both of those things are because they're interesting. So the Shroud of Turin is a long piece of linen cloth that some people believe was the cloth that Jesus's body was wrapped in upon his burial. So Walther McCrone has looked at the supposed shroud and examined it underneath the microscope, looking for proof that this could in fact be old enough, or even from the proper time frame, that it could be Jesus's burial cloth. He also did extensive work on something called the Vinland map. So the Vinland map is supposed to be a 15th century Norse map that predates Columbus's time. And that's interesting because at the point we still kind of thought, the world is flat and we don't know where everything is. But this 15th century map shows the continent of Africa and some other places that at the time modern people didn't, or supposedly didn't, know about. So he's also done some extensive work looking to see whether or not this map was true. Ironically enough, he found that the ink that the supposed Vinland map had on it had additives or extra chemicals that weren't in existence until the 1920s. So there's no way it could be from the 15th century. So very, very cool. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some of the equipment and some of the earlier equipment that we use in our field. Our field has grown so much, and technology is just helping the field of forensics and taking it to that extra degree that some of this stuff is going to seem very, very basic by comparison to other things that we'll talk about in class. Okay, so a huge part of forensics is built on or based in biology. And like I kind of mentioned before, the microscope has kind of been dubbed the biologist's equipment of choice. Like that, people tend to think that, oh, if you look through a microscope, you do something with biology. Now, that's not completely true, but forensics relies greatly on the microscope. So in 1828 was the invention of the first polarized light microscope, which really changed how we saw things and how much detail we could see things in. So it really helped our field, especially in the areas of things like hair samples and fiber samples and soil particles. We were now able to visualize things that before we didn't have a clear image of. Then in 1839, we had the first microscopic detection of sperm, which kind of changed the game for things like rape cases, which up until that point was more of a he said, she said type of situation. Okay, moving on to the next slide. In 1863 was the first presumptive test for blood. So presumptive test just tells us, if we're looking at blood versus some other substance that happens to be red. So it couldn't tell us what type of blood or even if it was animal or human, but just the mere fact that, yes, this is blood and it's not like tomato sauce or something. Then there was a 10-year span between the 1850s and 1860s where photography just kind of took off, and we had all of these developments that really improved how we keep records in forensic science. Prior to having good detailed decent photography, it was more of write it down, draw it out and hope you can draw well, or I hope you remember what it looks like because that's the only way you're going to capture those images. Having enhancements to the field of photography really allows us to take a snapshot and kind of preserve a piece of history of whatever that bit of evidence is. And we could always go back and look at it and see it again and process it and relive the information that it gives us. Okay, at this point, we're going to go through and talk about the crime labs that we have in the United States and kind of their history. You'll notice that some of them started a really long time ago. Ironic. So in 1923, the Los Angeles PD department, they pretty much opened the first crime lab, the very first crime lab in the United States that dealt with like crime on a large level, more than just, hey, you stole my cow. That lab is still in existence. It's still operational. It's from the 1920s. Then in the 1930s, the University of California at Berkeley, they opened up their first criminalistics department. So for the first time, you could go to school and study the early field of forensics. And that department was first headed up by someone called Paul Kirk, who we will talk about a little bit later. Okay, then in 1932, the FBI director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, opened up the FBI's version of the criminal lab, so the FBI lab, which is still up and in existence and working. And then in 1981, the FBI opened a forensic science research and training center. So it wasn't enough that we have the lab and we could study it. It was more, this center was more about pushing the boundaries of the field of forensics and really improving upon things and making things better and more efficient and more accurate. Okay, federal crime labs. So let's talk about the major ones that are in existence and kind of who they belong to. So we have, of course, the FBI lab, which is in Quantico, Virginia. Then we have the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA. They have a series of laboratories, and they have several that are spread throughout the country. Then there is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. They also have a series of laboratories. And note that the different types of labs have different functions. Like the drug people really pay attention to, more non-biological type evidence, chemical-based evidence. Whereas your ATF people, that's where like some of our arson claims and anything to do with like guns and shell casings and explosives and grenades and all of that gets handled by those labs. The US Army has their own crime investigation lab. They sometimes do work outside of just the Army, but it's traditionally meant for Army-related or military-related cases. And then the U.S. Postal Inspection Service has their own series of labs. And for a long time, people didn't understand what was the point. Why does our Postal Service have crime labs or investigative labs? Well, people send all kinds of things through the mail, and some of those things are deadly, and some of those things are ways of harming other people. So the Postal Service now has to have a way or a method to handle that and to be able to get better at detecting those kinds of packages. Okay, crime labs abroad. So the British Home Office, they have a series of labs. Their main one is based in London. It's called the Metropolitan Police Laboratory, and they also have 5 other regional labs spread out through the British Isles. And then Canada has the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They have a series of labs. They have a Center for Forensic Science, which is in Toronto, and they have the Institute of Legal Medicine and Police Science, which is in Montreal. Okay, so that's it for notes. Now, what do you need to know? I don't know, kind of all of it. Not really all of it. I promise I'll kind of fine tune and detail these out for you a little bit more when I come back. I just wanted us to go over all of the high points and at least get the introduction to the material happening while I was still gone. Okay, so at this point, let's go over where we are. We've just finished our notes. You still need to complete the important people document, and you need to complete the who would you call document. So we've talked about the history of forensics. That's what we did for notes. Now you're going to go ahead and apply that a little bit. So you're going to research those individual people. You can use your PowerPoint. You can use your phones. There are books for this class. I know you've never used them. If you look at the window at the back of the room where the blue curtain is, there's a book cart. The side of the book cart that's closest to you will have my AP Bio books on it. If you spin the book cart around, there are some yellow and orange forensic science books. You are free to use those. If you use them, please put them back. Do not create additional work for Miss Escobar. So you can use your phone, you can use your books, you can use your notes. Once you are done with the people sheet, you're going to go ahead and turn that in. Please fill it out in its entirety. Make sure you do the entire thing. And then you're going to go ahead and do the who would you call. I am happy if you work with up to one other person. So it can be you and a partner, or you can do it by yourself. But those are your only 2 options. You might need your notes that you took while we did career presentations to help you. Again, you can still use the book, discuss it with a friend, have actual discussion, not just, hey, what did you put for number 1? and get those done and turned in. And at that point, it should pretty much be the end of class. So you should be able to get those two things done in the time that you have left. You will have another video that will start off with notes over observations, just like we kind of did today. We'll start with our agenda. We'll talk about our focus. We'll take our notes. I'll remind you about the focus. There are a couple of things I need to talk about that you're getting next class, but we'll do that then. Okay. So be good. Do what you are supposed to. Have a great week, and I'll see you guys when I get back. Bye.